What does it really mean to be called a geek? You'll find out right after this. Hey everybody, I am Taylor from Beard vs. Geek, where I show you it is okay to be a man and a geek at the same time. Now, in order to understand what a geek is, we need to go back in time and we need to talk about historically what it means to be a geek. So let's start with, I don't know, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, those guys? Yeah? See, these guys brought forth in the Western world intellectual thought, philosophy, and they did that in their free time. So much so that they were actually paid teachers. And people would come to them from all over Greece in order to learn at their hand. And this realm of intellectual thought is what the first beginnings of the geek actually was. During the Middle Ages, when a lot of science was persecuted by the Catholic Church, geeks still remained. There were some people who were learned enough to read and to write, and in their free time they endeavored in intellectual thought, as opposed to other people who endeavored to, besides feeding themselves, to fish for fun, to take part in manly games, including wrestling and a whole bunch of other strength challenges that were traditionally manly. These people would take their time to read folios, to read what few books remained, and that proceeded through the whole Middle Ages into the colonial era, where people were starting to learn more than others how to read and how to write, and some people did that in their free time. Now, is this starting to sound familiar, where people didn't want to do manly activities outside of work and instead did other stuff, like intellectual stuff? Now, this brings us all the way into the late 19th century, so late 1800s, to where the word geek actually comes from. We need to turn to one of my good friends, the dictionary. Let's see here. Gawk, gazelle, gear, gearing, gear wheel, grek, geese. It's not in here. I need something a little bit more modern then. Oxford English Dictionary, definition of geek. Geek, noun. Definition 1, an unfashionable or socially inept person. Definition 1.1, a knowledgeable and obsessive enthusiast, i.e. a computer geek. So being a knowledgeable and obsessive enthusiast who is also unfashionable and socially inept. Yeah, that's pretty much me. The word Greek actually comes from a German or Scottish derivation. We're not entirely sure which. Some people say Scottish, some people say German, and that basically means fool. That's right, it is a word associated with carnival people, with fools. And in the early 20th century, the word geek was ascribed to people who were intellectual, who endeavored in their free time to learn and to grow as a human being and to take part in the activities that were not traditionally associated with men. Now, all this geekiness brings us to places like this. I'm at Joey's Arcade in the Pony Village Mall in North Bend, Oregon, where even today in the 21st century, you can play classic arcade games. You can buy and read comic books, plus get Magic the Gathering cards, action figures, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, because geekiness is now a way of life and we've accepted geekiness, you can come to places like this all over the country in the Western world and enjoy some classic arcade games and take part of that historic geekiness. And in the early 20th century, another thing came about. That meant pinball. Now, pinball is a game of skill, but it is also a game associated with geekiness, especially young boys and eventually now older men would play pinball in their free time and would endeavor to get that high score on that pinball machine. Now, even though pinball machines have changed in the past 100 years, they are still associated with early geekiness in the early 20th century. Now, this brings us to comic books. And comic books goes hand in hand with geekiness. Those colorful pictures and those words were at a proper reading level, not just for children who they were initially targeted at, but for young men as well. Men who were in their late teens and 20s and sometimes even early 30s would read and enjoy comic books. In fact, some even brought their comic books and were looking forward to comic books while fighting world wars. I mean, hell yeah. What kind of a geeky man is that? A kick-ass one, that's the answer. Now this brings us to the 1950s, where geek was an actual insult that bullies would tell kids at school who, I don't know, had glasses, read books, and actually did their homework. And these people were socially shunned for liking things that other boys did not like. These things included, I don't know, pinball, games, books, reading, actually doing well in their classes. Going into the 1960s and 1970s, the geek started to clasp onto a couple of different things. One, besides books and intellectual efforts, was also things that are now associated with geekiness, such as games, computers. And from those first computers that took up the size of a freaking building came one thing that is still associated with geeks: video games. And starting in the 1970s, arcade games like this started to become very popular. Especially this one, when it first came out, Miss Pac-Man, the sequel to the great Pac-Man. Now, if you don't mind, I only got 2 lives left. Now, video games quickly led to arcade games, and in the 1970s, 1980s, led to large arcades throughout the Western world, where people could take part in all sorts of different video games, all for $1. That got you 1 play. And that could be games like Frogger, Pac-Man, Asteroids, all sorts of classic arcade games developed by major companies who made millions of dollars. And these companies quickly turned to whether or not they can get video games in the home. In the 1990s, home video games and computers were all the rage. And in the 1990s, we saw a resurgence of the geek, where the geek took center stage. And because of that were 2 things: home video games and home computers. Now, although we had things like the Apple II, those were predominantly in the classroom and in businesses. But now in the 1990s, people can start to afford their own personal computer at home and their own home video game system. And because of that, the geeks, which were associated with computers and technology, came into the foreground and took charge by doing what? I don't know, inventing the fracking internet? That's right, a bunch of geeky men and women who are scientists contracted with the Department of Defense created the internet. And they quickly shared it with the rest of the world. And geeks were the first to grasp onto that by the cojones and bring it into the awesomeness that it is today. We're now in 2017. The geek is still associated with a couple of big things. Computers, even though I'm personally not that great at it. Video games, including global video games, such as World of Warcraft. EverQuest was popular. I don't even know if that's still running. And a bunch of other online games. And we're still associated with comic books. And now that in particular is being made into movies and being embraced by everyone else. Posers. Gosh. And if you like this video, make sure to subscribe. Great videos are coming out every week where I show you it is okay to be a man and a geek at the same time. You can also click on this video for historic manliness, or you can click on this video. Because after all, if the women don't find you manly, they should at least find you geeky. And until next time, don't go shaving on me.